And before I even dive into what we're talking about today, which is definitely the spine, we're going to be going a lot over like the curves and structure of the spine. It's just recommended the anatomy coloring books, just so you familiar yourself a little bit more with the bones and the muscles. Just so you have an idea of kind of what they are. And it's just a really good learning tool. You learn, I mean, obviously these Latin names are quite elaborate, so sometimes it's intimidating to learn, but as you're coloring them, like you're at least seeing the fiber directions of the different muscles and stuff, and we'll be able to get into that a little bit later. So just a really good resource, a really good tool, and it's fun to get to color, right?
There's the yoga version of the anatomy.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah, which is a good option for sure.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so first curve of the spine is the neck, right? The cervical spine. And the cervical spine consists of 7 vertebrae, and they're named accordingly. So it goes, right, C1 at the very top, and then C7 at the bottom.
And C7 is one I talk about a lot in class, because it kind of is that bumpy bit that sticks out at the bottom of the neck. So people are kind of familiar with that if you describe it as being that piece, and then they kind of know where you're at.
Right. So the biggest movement too at the neck, well, I mean, the neck definitely has the most movement of the entire spine, but C1 and C2, so C1 is a ring, right? And then C2 has more of a pivot or an axis point, a pillar almost, right? So it's this ring sitting on this pivot, which acts as an axis, right? So that's the articulation that causes the most rotation in the neck.
And so both ways, like this way
yes.
and this way?
No, it's more
of a twisting action?
No, it's straight up rotation. Yeah, so,
okay.
And then articulation, right, just so we're clear, is just where there's 2 surfaces that are joined together with the purpose of movement, right? And usually those 2 structures will have capsule around it, so that's your joint capsule, right? And then there's fluid in that capsule. There's even a little bit of cartilage, which would be the cushion, and then you also have to think of wherever they're joining, they would also be some kind of like membrane or tissue around that really helps for that sliding glide. But we'll be getting into joints a little bit further on when we do more of like the shoulder and the hip. But just so you're familiar with that word, right? Articulation, joint movements.
So the C1, C2 are right up at the top, right close to the skull, right? And so that's where most of the rotation is happening from.
Totally. Okay, cool. Totally. And then because there isn't really a lot of compressive load on the neck, and because there isn't really a lot of weight either, I mean, the head weighs about 10 to 11 pounds, but you know, in the bigger scheme of things, that's actually not a lot, so this is why there is by far the most movement at the neck. Right? So again, we went rotation, and then the other movements that happen at the neck are flexion. So flexion means going forward, right? So that would be dropping your chin down towards your chest.
Kind of like a forward.
Yeah,
forward flexion.
Yeah, and then extension would be back bending, is looking up, all the way up.
Backward, extending backwards, extending the neck. Gotcha.
Totally. Right. And then the other 2 would be side bend, right? So ear to shoulder, ear to opposite shoulder. So that's side bending or lateral flexion. Lateral is moving towards the side.
Lateral moving side. Now, those are coming from all the vertebrae in the neck?
Yeah. So each, there's a vertebral body, and they're each shaped a little bit differently. So in the neck, right, we don't have the ribs, right? So it's just a little bit of a different structure of the neck, which allows, again, all these different movements.
And isn't it true that everyone's vertebrae are basically shaped differently anyhow? Yeah. Which would explain mobility. People that are a lot more mobile, or people that are less mobile, with chronic headaches or what have you. Would you say that has something to do with it?
Headaches, though, can be a lot of things. It could also be just like tissue tension. But like, okay, so if we talk about mobility, you can have hypermobility, where you're getting excessive movement, and a lot of that would just be more like in the ligaments, right? So like, for example, with you know, so you do have a little bit of hypermobility.
I could if I wasn't in my mindful,
Right.
hurt myself. So for example, if I'm just like totally relaxed, not using the muscles, I can bring my neck to here, and it feels like I'm cranking into one spot of my neck, and it looks super mobile. Whereas if I really find my connection, stabilize my joints, really think about everything moving in different directions, my flexibility is only to here, but it feels more balanced and healthier, just to be honest.
Right.
So,
But we do want to encourage mobility, right? We want that movement at the joint to happen because then the tissues, right, the muscles around it aren't really going to grip onto that joint. They're not going to stiffen that joint because hypomobility is the opposite, right? When you're really stiff, you're like, you know what I mean? You're like, you can barely check one spot. And that's not what we want either. We're trying to find that balance. But yes, right, we want to be able to stabilize the joint and then stretch from that point.
yeah, and move, mindfully.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Totally. So you've been teaching child's pose a lot with neutral necks.
Yeah,
maybe we
that's
should
right.
demo that. So right, we want to have, and then just so you guys know too, right, so that dip inwards is a lordotic curve.
Lordotic.
Lordotic. So this is where it goes inwards. So if Michelle were to bust out into child's pose right now after she fixes her hair, yeah. So, you know, if you have a student, which it happens, right, they don't have the ability to bring their forehead down onto the ground, they can totally use, yeah, exactly, they can totally use a prop, a block, that kind of bolster support, and then she's got that lordotic cervical curve. Lots of new words, hey, lordotic cervical curve.
I sometimes describe it as like a soap dish or a hammock, and you want to be able to put that piece of soap or that body in it and have it be able to hang, as opposed to like
This.
no curve, or what we see a lot of is people are like, oh, I want to get my head to the floor, and then they've got this huge C7 picking up, and then they're just, you know, they're not getting that nice curve, which for me, like that curve kind of acts as like a absorber, like a shock absorber kind of thing.
And that's essentially what our spine does, is it does absorb.
And it's not that you can't eventually, you know, have a curve and have your head on the floor, because that's got a decent curve to it there, right? Or if I went with my knees wider, I can still get that curve. It's just the average neck can really benefit from just a little bit of height underneath it to encourage that release, right, Tania?
Right, absolutely. And also, we live in a world where this head is getting propelled forward all the time, right? And it's not just, yes, okay, devices, it's easy to blame it on devices, but the reality is we're driving, we're chopping vegetables, we're with children, right? Like our life, we are propelled forward, right? And then so this starts to happen.
Like even our grandmothers, you know, my grandmother was like this from just her regular job, and she never had a computer, right? And she got that sort of hunchy back here, back,
which is leading right into the next curve, right? Which is the thoracic curve. So this is our rib cage. This is the middle of our back, which is now the opposite, right? It dips in and then it comes out to a kyphotic curve. So this would probably be a good place that we're gonna just insert a picture of the spine.
a nice little picture of the spine.
Thank you, Stephen. So the only thing I didn't really talk about is obviously like it's really important that we want to, as I'm going through the different curves, like it's the reason why it's important to maintain these curves is because inside the vertebral body, it's our spinal cord, right?
Yeah.
It's our spinal cord and it's our brain, and we want to be able to not be compromising the space because there's a gap in between those bones, which then the nerves, right, stem out of, and that's our neurological.
So basically what you're saying is the spine is there with its shock absorbers, and it's storing the spinal cord, which all the nerves are connected to. In yoga, we also believe that that's like an energy pathway, like a major, the Sushumna Chanel, which just allows energy to move up and down the spine, male, female, and eventually Kundalini energy. And so if our spine is not acting as it should, supporting that spinal cord, then there could be an impingement to the flow to the nerves, to the flow of energy, you know, the nadis, that kind of thing. That's kind of what you're getting to. For me, a big reason why we look at the structure of the spine is also to allow ourselves to breathe, right? It's really hard to breathe like this as opposed to when we can really open that chest and fully use our lungs.
And that's what we're getting into next now as we get into the thoracic spine. Okay, so
That's
let's show
right.
on Michelle's back here. So, right, that bump is C7, and then she doesn't really have, but it does, right? It comes out a little bit and it goes, so it's T1 to T12. And the structure of these particular vertebral bodies are a little bit different because T1 to T12 then articulates with the rib cage, right? Each respective rib, which wraps around and eventually attaches onto her breastbone, her
Except for those floating ones, right?
The floating ones are lower down. The
Yeah.
floating ones are 11 and 12.
Yeah, so there's only 2 floating ribs?
Yes, 2 floating ones, and then the rest, there's a lot of cartilage in there, which is a cushion, and then it attaches onto that sternum. So because of the rib cage, and then also because the shoulder blades sit right on top of that rib cage, it actually limits a little bit of flexion going forward and extension going backward through this segment of the spine, right?
Yeah.
So this segment of the spine is where we rotate, is where we twist.
Now, isn't there one particular vertebra that we generally twist from?
Usually it's around T7.
Yeah.
And then also very interesting at T12, which is all the way at the very bottom, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have that hip flexor muscle that attaches onto T12, did I say T11? T12 from the front. So there's another kind of connection point too.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of twists, right, we're using that whole thoracic cage or rib cage to rotate our body through these twists.
Well, and one thing that I've really learned is that if I don't have an erect spine, then it really compromises my twist. For example, if I'm hunching forward, even in this bendy body, this is as far as I go. Whereas the minute I really find it, I go a lot further. So then the other thing that I've really learned with twisting and the spine is if you don't maintain at least somewhat of a neutral pelvis, you can really over twist. And that's where you get into the more, too much mobility and not enough stability.
Right.
Whereas if I can, keep a little bit of control of my pelvis, I can also really get into the
Well,
organs and stuff.
and then in this case, your pelvis, it's like an anchor point.
Mm-hmm.
It's that anchor point, that seat that you would then pivot around and off.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, what else are we going to talk about? The thoracic spine. Oh yeah, so then, again, if we're going into a lot of postural things, right? So as soon as the head starts to go forward, then we all start, the hump will then follow. And then all of a sudden, right, that hump, that anterior rotation, so that forward rotation of your shoulder heads, you've collapsed into your first rib, your second rib, your third rib. And then if we're going back to the 3-part breath or the pranayama work, you're missing like the entire upper lobes of your lungs because the lungs extend all the way up into the top of the collarbones. So it's important.
Well, this is compressed too, so it's hard for me to breathe into my ribs. Then we just get this super shallow, maybe a little bit of lower belly breath, right?
Yep, totally.
And just not taking full advantage of the full lungs.
Yeah. Okay, so then respiration. Now let's talk a little bit about the diaphragm, which is the main muscle to help us with our breathing. The diaphragm is it's like a dome, right? So it separates the thoracic cavity. So we have a cavity right? A cave. It holds onto the lungs and the heart, and then the diaphragm separates it as that midpoint line and below the abdominal cavity, and that's where all the organs sit, right? So when we take a breath in, the diaphragm contracts and it expands, as does all the muscles in between the ribs, right? The intercostal muscles, and that increases thoracic volume, right? It increases the volume, which then decreases the pressure. I know it's really confusing, but that decrease in pressure, it then acts like a vacuum. We all know what vacuums do. They suck in, right? So then all of a sudden you have this ability to take in that breath and do that 3-part breath. Because essentially this pranayama is all about full capacity of our lungs. I think it's in an average male 6 liters of air, of oxygen, per breath. So that's a lot if you're using it at capacity.
Well, the average person is breathing in 0.5 liter to 1 liter max, right? And I've heard babies can get up to 8 liters of oxygen, right? Super trained at it for years, up to 8 liters of oxygen. So comparing,
per breath, right?
Yeah.
Per breath.
yeah, and comparing a half a liter to a liter of oxygen to a possible 8 liters of oxygen, our entire body functioning runs on oxygen, it only makes sense that we're gonna run better with more oxygen intake, and then also the ability to get rid of that carbon dioxide,
Right,
which
which
is
is
stale.
which is the opposite, right? So then the thoracic cavity does the opposite. The volume decreases, the pressure increases, and you can release the air
Yeah,
out.
yeah, which is great.
So that was kind of like a crash course a little bit on respiration. But you know, the diaphragm muscle, you can access it. So if you were to palpate your breastbone, right? This is your chest bone, your sternum, if we're going all the way to sternum. You get to the end of your sternum, there should be a little kind of knobby bit right there. That's called your xiphoid process. Not really relevant. But then if you go out a little bit towards the sides, and here, if you do kind of concave and collapse in, you might be able to stick your fingers, and a lot of times it's a little bit tender, right? So that would be us accessing a little bit of that diaphragm muscle.
Interesting, you can feel it there, right?
I mean, the stomach and liver sit kind of right there as well, but yeah, no, you can definitely palpate and feel a little bit of that diaphragm. It's tender. It's usually really tender. Okay, so then, right, we did twist a little bit, and then I know that you teach, or in this module, we're also doing the allergy series, right? So then this is the ability to really start to open up that side body and access. So they're called the intercostal muscles. They're very, very strong, small fibers, but we're trying to stretch those muscles.
And things like cat-cow, you know, like really getting in there. Again, just moving those vertebrae, moving those discs, getting those intercostals moving. Because it's hard to like change posture until you can actually get movement into the disc between the vertebrae. And I'd love it if you spent a little bit of time just describing what a disc is, what its function, what happens to it as it ages.
Just crazy. Okay, so let's move down the spine. Okay, so again, so we have our cervical, we have our thoracic, and now we're into our lumbar curve, right? So if you think of it right off the get-go, the lumbar curve, which dips in again, is that lordotic curve, L1 to L5, although the sudden now it has more of a compressive force, more weight, obviously, because now it's like halfway down our body, right? So these guys, again, they regain motion. They do a lot more flexion and extension. So there's your forward fold, there's your back bend. They do the rotation, they do the side bending, right? But they are definitely holding more of the load, okay? And then the final curve is our sacrum. So the sacrum is that last bone at the spine. It's a triangular shape, right? And so these particular vertebrae are actually fused together. They're
And for me, like my feeling about the sacrum is, because those are fused vertebrae, I find that any type of movement you can get in there, whether that be pelvis tilts, or whether that be like peeling the sacrum like a sticker, or laying it down like a sticker or wallpaper, it's just such a great way to keep it as much movement in there as you can, and not blocking nerves and energy, and just letting things slide, because it can get really blocked in there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a different joint structure. Like it's not, again, you know, I was describing a little bit before how it, like the joints have an actual capsule, and they have the cartilage or the cushion, and they have the fluid. This particular joint is a little bit different, but it does have like a little bit of movement, which we cover with you, and so that would be neutral pelvis. So that sacrum, that triangular bone, it just slides right down into the pelvic bowl, right? So the pelvis are these different bones that then make, when I teach it, I'm like, it's a bowl.
Yeah.
The pelvis is a bowl. So then that sacrum will then tilt forward and tilt backwards. It hikes up, it hikes down, and then it rocks in this direction, which is all the movements that we cover in neutral pelvis, right? Yeah. And then we go all the way down to the very bottom of the sacrum, which is the coccyx, which, you know, is the tailbone, and, you know, a lot of people don't realize it, but the tailbone can, you know, it can deviate a little bit. It can deviate just means move to one side or the other side. you know, if anyone's had any kind of trauma. And it doesn't even have to be a big trauma, like, I don't know, one of my patients was recently just snowboarding and she took a bail and she fell on her butt and she's like, yeah, I felt this, like,
Yeah.
she felt this.
Anyone who's fallen down the stairs,
Yeah.
you know,
Falling on the
most
ice.
women, yeah, most women who give birth end up with hypoxics going one way or another. Yeah, and there's poses, like we do a lot of work on the block, like doing Setu Bandha, and then slowly straightening out the legs. And I've seen so many tailbones or coccyx get straightened out from that. But they have to move really, really slowly, because if you have a tilted coccyx, this is really, really intense.
Yeah.
And really keeping the legs super active for that one.
So that's the spine, right? And the sacrum, it's slight, but it rounds, similar to the thoracic spine, it rounds back out just a little bit, right? It has a little bit of that kyphotic kind of curve to it and dip outwards. So again, you know, to maintain proper posture, right, we're sitting on all the different curves of the spine. So essentially, 25% of the load sits on the facet joints, which are the joints kind of a little bit more at the front of the spine, and then 75% of the load, the compressive force on the spine, sit on the discs and the muscles. So for the lower back, right, if you have a hyperlordotic curve, right, so we see this in some women that really have like a big, then they're putting way too much pressure on those joints. But then and then you see this a lot where you lose the lordotic curve, so now you're hypo, like you're basically a flat back. And with people with flat backs that have pain is because they're putting a lot more of the weight on the discs and on the muscles. They don't have that like even distribution of weight, right?
So this is also called an anterior tilt to the pelvis, correct?
Yes.
And a posterior tilt?
Yes.
Yeah. Which is common, and in yoga that's something as teachers we really look for.
Right.
Is what kind of a tilt someone has, or whether it's twisted one way, hiked up one way, that kind of thing. Because if we can start to figure out the pelvis and the angles that it tends to, or the habits of the pelvis, then we can really help people to find those muscles that are overworked, tired, tight, and the muscles that are underworked, weak,
Fatigued.
maybe hypermobile. Yeah, fatigued. Yeah,
Totally.
yeah.
Okay, so if we go back to that facet joint, that's where like that segmental moving, right? So you know we have the ability to move each vertebra at a time. We do when we roll forward or when we roll back up. So in between those discs, in between those vertebral bodies are the discs. So this is leading into a little bit of those discs, right? So inside, so they're plump, right? They're plump, they're juicy, they absorb shock. And then unfortunately with wear and tear, with age, they're not so juicy anymore. They turn a little bit, it's a terrible comparison, but they're a little bit more like a hockey puck. We don't necessarily want hockey pucks in our back. So what happens in the discs is there's a fluid inside the disc. And how I like to explain it, it's like a jelly donut, right? If you think of when you bite into a jelly donut, there's the filling, and the filling is really like, you know, it's smooth, it's viscous, it's delicious usually. But, right, you have the jelly in the donut. So what happens when we start to put, right, we lose that curve, we have that flat back, the jelly of the jelly donut, it starts to creep backwards, So not only then are we like putting more load on the disc, we're also putting more load of the jelly donut in the disc, right? So this is where back bends are amazing in yoga, because back bends facilitate not necessarily the disc to move, but at least to have that even distribution of the jelly donut, right? When you go backwards, it kind of pushes that fluid, that viscous substance, it redirects it, and then all of a sudden you have that even distribution again.
Where it can be so useful with like herniated discs,
Yes.
split discs, where they kind of come out to the side. Bulge disc is another scenario, which is where the jelly donut comes on the outside, which is obviously a lot more painful, and we want to address that in a different way. But even just starting with like super simple back bends, like the simple back bends or the basic back bends where you're on your belly, you're not even coming up too high, and then as students, you know, seem to do well with that, moving forward into deeper back bends, little bridge pose, coming down one disc, one vertebra at a time, can really create that movement. And even cat-cow, like a simple cow back bend,
can really start to get discs into place. But we obviously want to be really careful when we're working with a student that has a disc injury, that we have an understanding. Personally, when I work with people with disc injuries, I start with them with their backs completely on the floor for at least a month and just see how they're doing with their other body parts. See if we can just get the smallest back end, which is like imprinting, arching the pelvis. And if they can't do that, then keeping them on the floor until I feel like that they've moved past that point of injury.
Yeah. And with back bends too, it strengthens our back muscles, right? So, those back bends, that lumbar extension, again, we're lifting up, and usually we're lifting up against gravity, we're lifting up our own body weight. We tend to then start really strengthening those back muscles, because everyone's like, I need to work on my core, I need to work on my core. It's a corset. It wraps all the way around. So yes, of course, it's important to have that kind of connection to the belly and those muscles, but it's just as important to have that with the back muscles.
Well, the other thing that the back bends do is if you are really working those core abdominal muscles, we don't want them just to be strong, we want them to be flexible as well. Because as much as the 8-pack looks great, it's causing you back pain and poor digestion, it's not really serving you.
Yeah, totally. You should sit properly.
All right, so this is video 2, and this is spine, anatomy spine in relation to twisting and orthopods.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so inside, so we talked a little bit about last class, the rib cage, right? It makes this cavity. So inside the rib cage at the very top, right, lungs, heart sits a little bit more on the right. The liver is, the heart sits a little bit more on the left. The liver is on the right-hand side, and the liver is 4 to 5 pounds. It's actually a pretty big organ.
Well, the interesting thing too is the heart muscles take up so much space that the left lungs are smaller, and they're also harder to breathe into because of that. And so it's really important. We see people often collapsing on that side, and also just really important to get that space so that we can access that side of our lung, because obviously heart tissue can accumulate toxins and tension just as much as any other tissue, and the heart has a pretty gosh darn important function. So it's important to be able to massage that area using the lungs, using the breath, using movement.
Totally. Okay, so then because that heart is sitting on the left side, right, we then have our stomach, which is also on the left, and then tucked behind the stomach we have kind of like pancreas and spleen, but tucked way behind. So the liver and stomach, they actually have, so this is different than, this is motility now, so the organs they move, right? They slide and glide, just like most of the tissue in our body slides and glides, the organs slide and glide as well. So they actually roll onto each other at midline. Midline is this, right? And then they roll away from each other. They roll into each other, they roll away from each other. So that's the movement that they do, right? So this is why it's really important that we take these big seated twists, because we're really encouraging the organs then to be able to move. And when the organs have their inherent movement, they can also function at their optimal. They can really, do what they do, right?
Well,
especially the liver, right? Especially.
Yeah, it just gets things moving. And then also the lymphatic system, right? You can access that a little bit with twist, correct? Yeah. And then when you think about how long the digestive tract is, isn't it like 8 feet long or something ridiculous like that?
Yes, but I think you're thinking specifically of the small intestine, which is that long, it wraps all around itself. And another interesting aspect about the small intestine is, I think it's like a football field. I didn't look that one up, but it definitely is a super long structure. It's not obviously just going to spill its contents out. So how it gets hooked onto the back of the abdominal wall is through a piece of fascia, which interestingly enough looks like sea kelp. It totally looks like a sea kelp. So then you have that holding that back, and then you have your colon, which is your large intestine. Right side is ascending comes up, and then you have transverse transverse that goes across, and then descending, which then comes down.
And so the fascia is keeping all of that in place, as well as the muscles, right? And so what are your thoughts about stretching the fascia, health?
Well, just longer holds, right? And you can really get those little releases that you wouldn't think. Because sometimes obviously if you're doing more of a dynamic movement, right? So, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, that's when you're really able to stimulate the lymphatics. That's when you're getting that.
Which is a combo,
yes.
A one-way pump system.
Yeah. Yeah, so you're getting, and that lymphatic system is processing a lot of toxins.
You can also catch nerves that way too, right? Like you can release like a nerve. So there's definite benefits to movement, but there's also definite benefits to the stillness.
The static, the longer holds, where you will get a little bit more of that like fascial pull. Okay, so hold on. Fascia, our bodies are layered where it's skin, it's connective tissue, aka fascia, muscle, and bone. So those layers should all be pliable on top of one another.
They should slide.
Yeah,
They shouldn't be stuck and stagnant. And so in an immobile body, a body that doesn't do a lot of stretching, maybe doesn't do a lot of movement or not a lot of different movements, maybe they do a repetitive movement, the fascia stops sliding. It's almost like it catches. And then these fascial lines, which are huge and long and cross the body, end up tugging or pulling or causing injury in a completely different area of your body, just related to them not doing their job properly. I've always kind of thought of fascia as like cling film that wraps things and keeps it in place, but if that cling film gets stuck on the meat, like frozen on that meat, it can tear the meat, right? Whereas if it's able to move and it doesn't get all stuck, it's more comfortable, it has better function, blood, oxygen, energy can get into the different parts of the body.
And then for a visual too, like that fascial layer, it's like a spider web in our body, right? So it crosses each other, it extends from top to bottom, it goes around, so it's really elaborate.
And it's meant to move, right? Like it has fibrous things that kind of move and grow and change all the time.
So like just for example, like I was talking about the colon. So the colon actually has these two little suspensory ligaments, fascia, right, that kind of like, it holds it up. So that transverse colon it's almost like a clothesline, right? And it has these two little pegs holding it up. And those ligaments are actually continuous right into the diaphragm. So that muscle that we talked about last class, right, that muscle of respiration. So then all of a sudden, that muscle of respiration then is obviously facilitating the lungs. The lungs extend all the way up to the very top of the collarbones, right, this bone here, the clavicle, and then you have all those neck attachments so this is our neck musculature, but some of that neck musculature attaches onto like rib 1, rib 2, rib 3, right? So there's a connection right there of how the colon is actually affecting the diaphragm, which is affecting like some of the movement, right? And if you're getting this on the neck, then of course it's going to be a lot harder to move it around and stuff.
And that obviously takes you out of that natural curve of the neck as well that we were talking about.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So let's do some twists.
Okay. So one thing that I really notice with necks and with twists is a lot of students tend to like have that sort of lack of a curve or access more of a curve where they're almost looking up or looking down. And so one of the things that I like to describe when thinking of a neutral neck is if you close your eyes and open your eyes, you're looking straight ahead at the horizon, not down at the floor, not up a little bit. And sometimes students can find that. But the interesting thing is if a student is really determined, they can be like this and lift their eyes up and they don't even realize they're doing it. So it's usually easier to find on the floor, but it's nice for a ballpark thing. So what were you going to say about twists?
Just also like you want to think that your chin is actually parallel to the floor. So usually you can tell if your chin is down a little bit or up a little bit. Like sometimes I think, when you go and you would rest, you see it more in animals, right? They go and they like rest their head on like the counter or like a ledge or something. You can tell that they actually have their neck in neutral. So sometimes I get that too. I get students to just put their hand there and then they can kind of be like, okay, then my chin is actually parallel to where the floor line is. Okay, so then your right hips to armpits, you're finding a lot of that length, and then you're just doing a beautiful twist.
So when twisting, one of the things we look look at is, are my shoulders level? And so what some people do is like bring that right shoulder down, bring that right shoulder down, instead of fixing it at what I would call the base or the root of the problem, which is the pelvis. So the first thing you want to look at is, are the hips level? Are you sitting even in the sit bones? Are you too far on the front of the sit bones? Chandra, are you on the back of your sit bones? So again, finding that movement of the pelvis here could be helpful, whether you're going front of the sit bones, middle of the sit bones, back of the sit bones, middle of the sit bones, front of the sit bones, middle of the sit bones, back of the sit bones. When in a seated twist, I often like to find just the front of the sit bones. So I'm kind of encouraging that lumbar curve, but definitely not wanting to go into the backs of the sit bones, which is not a great way to twist, because even in this body, that's about as far as I can get. It is very limiting. Whereas if I find the center or the front of the sit bones, I can get into the organs without jamming my back. And then think hip bones, and then think armpits lifting away from the hip bones without those shoulders hiking up. So what I visualize is my pelvis is rooting down. I think of my ribs as a garbage can, so I don't want to spill the garbage backwards by shortening in my back body and bulging my front body. I don't want to spill the garbage forward by lengthening in my back body, shortening my front body. I don't want to bulge on the left, shorten on the right, spilling the garbage to the right. I don't want to bulge on the right, shorten on the left, spilling to the left. I want to try and find that garbage can of the ribs, lift it straight up, and then relax the shoulders like a lid on a garbage can. I want it even. I don't want them uneven. I don't want them hiking up to my ears. I don't want them trying to slam down on the garbage can. I just want them placed on the garbage can, right? So it's nice and light, and there's no tension in the neck that way. And then what I think of is I just really think about moving nice and slow, and I use my muscles to move the spine. So I think really lower abdomen pulling in, and I pull it in at an angle, and I slide it as if I'm tucking it in under that bottom rib. And then I really start low like that, and then I go to the ribs, and if I'm twisting to the right, it would be the front right ribs moving back, and the back left ribs moving forward, right? The trick here is to not to let these shoulders jam forward, right? Because then you stop the twist, but think shoulder heads back, armpits lifting up and sliding forward. So as I continue to twist, I'm just thinking about this shoulder head moving back. Then the final thing I think of is really having hands underneath my back, left shoulder blade in this case, and a hand sort of high up underneath my right chest to rotate me further. I'm always a fan of moving the neck last, because if I start with my neck, I'm automatically jammed and I don't go as far as I possibly could if I don't.
And once you're in your twist position, you have the ability to move the neck, regardless of where her rib cage is, where that.
And that's because I haven't done this, right? So as soon as I did this, my neck is uncomfortable and it doesn't want to move.
Right.
So it's looking for that neutral neck, not wanting that C7 to hike out, not wanting to over-exaggerate the curves, but honor their natural kind of flow.
Yeah. And then, yeah, perfect.
Yeah, makes sense?
Yeah, totally. And those intercostal muscles, the ones that we are stretching in between, they're strong. They're really, like if you think of ribs, like when we eat ribs, like they're actually really, the process of even cooking ribs to tenderize them, right? So those fibers are extremely, and they're short muscle fibers, because if you think of it like rib space, and then there's these little muscles, zigzags in between them, so they're really strong. So this is another reason why it's really great to do it at that segmental kind of twist, and then you're really trying to stretch all of those. And then ultimately, right, as we're twisting as well, what are we doing? We're bringing the organs out, we're bringing out the liver, we're bringing out the stomach, and we're encouraging that slide and glide to happen at that visceral level.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Just really allows you to breathe into spots too. Like here I can really access that left side of the lung. Really access those left ribs. Breathe into that space. You can see soon my chin's dropped too much, my neck gets jammed. I'm looking at my neck gets jammed, whereas if I can really find that pelvis, there's no jam.
Okay, let's look a little bit more at neutral pelvis. So before, and then obviously, right, neutral pelvis is we're using the pelvic bowl. So I talked last class about that sacrum, and then it articulates into the actual pelvic bowl, and that's pretty important because that's where a lot of our reproductive organs, they sit, right? They sit down in that bowl.
And it's the base of so many of our poses, right? Like we're you know, like if we're in a seated position, our roots or the base of our pose, what the structure of the pose is built on is the pelvis, right? Even when we're doing core work here, you know, the roots or the pelvis, this is where the base is, this is where we're gonna stretch away from in all these directions, right? We're not stretching away from the feet here, the feet are stretching away from the pelvis, the torso is stretching away from the pelvis. It really is a powerful part of our body for stability.
So then in that pelvis, there's like a socket or a hollow where the head of your femur bone, which is your thigh bone, it gets sucked into. So this is a ball and socket joint, right? And the biggest ones are the hip and the shoulder. But the hip and shoulder are a little bit different because the shoulder, it's actually a really big head of the arm bone, head of the humerus bone, and it's actually a really small little surface that it articulates in. So then that head of the shoulder really moves around, and there just isn't the same kind of ligament support around the shoulder joining in, or the arm bone joining into the shoulder blade, right? There's a couple of little strings for ligaments, so you really rely on your rotator cuff. However, because of this presentation of this particular joint, it's freely movable, right? You have all ranges of motion here. So we talked last class, right, about flexion and extension, forwards and backwards, and then now we're getting to external rotation, the ability to rotate that arm out to the side, and then internal rotation, rotate that arm back in. Okay, and then we also have
The same for leg, right?
Yes,
External,
absolutely.
internal.
So how it differs from the hip socket or the hip joint is that there's this negative pressure. So that head of the femur bone, it really gets sucked in there because it's this deep concave that it really gets sucked into. And then it has a very elaborate ligament structure around it. Like there's a lot of hip ligaments that's really holding that hip socket into place because it can really withhold, impact, trauma, weight bearing, right? If you think about running and walking and all of that stuff.
Sitting, right? And people that aren't using that hip joint as a ball and socket joint, it then is no longer a ball and socket joint, and then it makes the knee act like a ball and socket joint, which it isn't. The knee is meant to be a hinge, right? So one of the things I like to think of is if we don't have the hip working as the ball and socket joint and it's steady, then the knee in between is going to get messed up, right? We want to make sure that the joints on either side of that hinge joint, which is a little bit more delicate, are really functioning as best they can, right? So ankles and hips are not only essential for back and hip and ankle health, but really essential for knee health.
So if we are to do like a neutral pelvis, we did this a little bit last class, so let's do it again, right? So that pelvis, it tilts forward, it tilts back, right? It hikes up, it hikes down.
So it goes to the armpit, away from the armpit. So if I'm moving the right hip to the right armpit, I'm shortening on the right side and I'm bulging on the left. So essentially, if we're thinking about that garbage can, it's spilling to the right. If I go the opposite way, it's spilling to the left. I could have my right hip bone closer to the floor, my left hip bone further away.
Yeah.
Right? So here my hips are moving to the floor, away from the floor. And I move that essentially by moving my femurs, right? If I pull my femur in, my right hip bone drops, my left hip bone lifts. If I pull my left femur in, the opposite happens, right? I can do the same thing by moving my hip flexors or my sacrum as well, moving it to the floor, away from the floor, but it essentially moves my femurs as well. The imprinting and the arching is interesting, because a lot of people are imprinting the entire time they're on their back.
And it takes a while to get used to it, right? It's so for I would say the general population, maybe not like students that have been practicing for a while, but your newer students, it takes a while to get used to really even just wrapping around like the vocabulary and the words that you're using, and then of course the ability to start feeling those very for some people it's quite subtle, these movements, right?
Yeah.
But once you have that movement in the pelvis, you're really starting to just release some of those lower back muscles that can tend to grip a little bit and cause lower back pain.
Well, and by creating a stability of structure, we're able to isolate muscles too.
Yes.
Instead of like just letting your pelvis do what it always does and always using those same muscles, always stretching the same muscles. If you can access that neutral pelvis, you're gonna get more bang for your buck. You're gonna be able to, really truly heal your back, hips, pelvis.
So then,
knees.
so with Michelle in neutral pelvis now, and then if we lead right into hip series 1, for example, right, where it's moving the leg, so now she's really acting at that ball and socket joint. And the more that we can move the joint, right, specifically inside that capsule, that fluid in there is really going to lubricate the joint, it's going to nourish the joint, and yeah, it's just going to keep the joint a lot happier, because whatever gets stuck in there, which it can, right, the capsule itself can get a little bit stuck, we just want to be able to start to move that around. And that's all that hip series 1, where the pelvis is neutral and we're doing all the different movements.
Yeah. Right. Trying to access its ability to be a ball and socket joint.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is I really believe that you have to have the pelvis neutral in order to find those natural curves of the spine as well. And then encourage and strengthen all the movements in the directions that the spine can lead us, right?
Right, absolutely. And it's a lot easier to do the work on the floor, because then you have that tactile contact of the floor on the sacrum and on the thoracic curve. And then it's like, I can actually slide my hand behind my neck, I can slide my hand in my lower back, and you can start to really kind of feel the curves.
And it supports your back, right? Not everyone has a strong enough back to sit on the floor, let alone, stand in a neutral pelvis. They just don't have that awareness.
Yeah.
It's a lot easier to find it on their back.
Okay, and then if we just go to easy, like super easy seated Sukhasana, which is, for me, I always sit on a block. Well, I guess you already had started to do this, but I then have the ability to feel that bowl. I have the ability to sit on the very kind of apex of the sitting bones, so then I know I can start to, at least a little bit, because there's a clam-shaped muscle on the outside of the hip, right? It really looks like a clam shape. It's called your tensor fascia latae. I know these Latin names are always like, but a lot of people are really, really tight in these hips, right? And so you go to sit in a cross-legged position, you want to have the ability to actually be a little bit softer in those outer, grippier, gruntier hip muscles. So then you tie in the feet, you're a little bit more active through that, right, that baby side edge of the foot, and then you can really be in a little bit more of a comfortable seat to do, a meditation or pranayama practice.
Well, if someone's sitting and their knees are high and slipping down to their hips, number one, it's almost impossible to be on the center of the sit bones, and number two, they're gripping so much in their hips that it's just going to tug into their back, and it's not going to send them in the direction they want to go. They're just going to keep getting tighter and tighter. Whereas if you add the height like Tania has, she's going to get more and more open, and gradually, if she wanted to, she'd eventually sit on the floor,
I kind of like the height though.
Yeah, it's right.
It's nice for the height goals. I like the height. And then it also gives you the ability, right, to then use your hands just really gently against your lap, so then you can sit up a little bit taller, right? We tend to even start to do this a little bit, so then we have the ability again to find those curves going up.
True that. So should we look at the neutral pelvis in relation to the neck and the thoracic with legs up the wall? Like
Yes.
Earlier.
Absolutely. So, legs up the wall. So legs up the wall, right, this has a lot to do with our hearts. So our heart is a ticker, right? It's pumping, and it's always having to pump the blood out into the extremities. So if you think of it, right, it's working hard to make sure that we're getting the circulation in our legs. And what is this doing? This is just helping our heart, right? Because it's helping that blood go right back to the heart. So it's actually less strain on the heart. And it's like the quickest, fastest, easiest way to really deeply relax ourselves.
Yeah.
So you're in neutral.
I'm in neutral pelvis, which is tricky to do with the legs extended. So I'm acting as if there was a wall behind my legs. I've got my pubic bone and my hip bones level. The tendency here is to imprint the low back, which makes it a lot easier for me to do physically because I'm not using muscles. I can just let go, but it's not bad. It's just not getting as much out of the pose as I possibly could.
And but not everyone is bendy like Michelle. So for a lot of people, exactly, they're more at an inclination. They more have an incline where they're at.
The wall would be where my heels are. I could also do, with students that are very new, bend knees, 90-degree angle is a great place to find it, and then have them straighten their legs and find it. It's accessible. People want to have their butt to the wall more than they think they want a neutral pelvis, and again, it's not bad, it's just not as effective. So as we become better teachers, as we become better students, we start to realize how important it is and how we can use that to our advantage. So finding that pubic bone, hip bones level, it allows me to have something to lengthen away from. So if you think of my spine, if I don't have an anchoring point, it's really hard for me to evenly lengthen. Whereas if I think of this strap buckle as an anchor point, like my pelvis, I can pull my spine, twist my spine, and lengthen it evenly away from that anchor point. So here, the anchor point's the pelvis, and then if I'm like bulging in the front, shortening in the back, then I can use my elbows to lengthen the back rib cage away, and then lengthen my cervical spine. If I tend to not be straight, I can find my pelvis. I can see, oh, I'm not straight. I can straighten out, making sure my nose, navel, pubic bone are a straight line. If I tend to be shorter on one shoulder than the other, I can move that armpit away from the hip bones. I can feel the hip bones. I can feel the armpits. I can create that more of a neutral spine, neutral neck, which we're looking for. But even with or without the neutral pelvis, we often see students with legs at the wall that are like this, hey Tania, and so that's not serving them. And so the best thing we could do is just give them a little bit of height, just a little bit of height underneath their neck so they're not like this, or the students that are like this, we want to give them that lift. So that if we closed our eyes, we truly relaxed our eyes like they were heavy in our head, we opened our eyes, we'd be looking straight up at the ceiling, right? And I also find if I do a little bit of a rocking, a tiny little rocking, if I've got a neutral neck, it creates a straight line on the back of my skull, whereas if my chin is lifted, it makes kind of like a frown on the back of my skull, or if I'm triple chin too low, it makes like this way it's kind of like a happy face, and this way it's kind of like a frown. Yeah. You can feel it's not as straight as when I have neutral. Yeah. And the other thing we want to look for is that our ears are equal distance from our shoulders, because we get a lot of this, where if we closed our eyes and opened our eyes, we're looking one direction or the other. And if we really truly felt the space between our ears and our shoulders, it often shortens on one side and not the other. And again, without the neutral pelvis, the rest of my body would adjust to make me feel straight, even though I'm not supporting my spine in the best way I possibly can. And I'd love you to talk just a little bit about scoliosis and neutral pelvis and how beneficial finding those lower back muscles, those pelvic muscles can be for helping with scoliosis.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. So scoliosis is when you have a rotational curve in the spine, so it will kind of like turn out to one side or turn out to the other side. So for some people it's quite mild, but for some people it's quite a rotation, and that whole rotation will will torque their pelvis off, so then all of a sudden the bowl isn't neutral anymore, right? You don't have that nice bowl. The bowl is either going to be torquing a little bit forward or a little bit backwards. So this is really nice where then, right, you have that, again, all of that we've been talking about is the stability, but then we're able to start, I mean, it takes a really long time. It's not something that's, right, but at least we're starting to support that rotation and start to be able to draw it back towards midline, right? It's all about finding, and the thing too is that it's teaching the muscles that have been, lengthened away or weakened. All of a sudden, they have the ability, okay, yes, I have this formation in my spine, but I can start to correct that self, right? I can start to really maybe focus more on the muscles that are going to help to find that pelvis.
And it will shift, and it doesn't have to shift completely. You can have a pain-free, healthy back with scoliosis, and you can see a full-on twist, but you've done this work, this pelvis work, to strengthen the muscles to support that twist, right? Because a twist is going to cause some muscles naturally to get really strong and some to get really weak. And if we just continue to allow that to happen, then we get pain, right? What we want to do is accept that we are all different. There's not a single human body that doesn't have stuff, that doesn't have things that we need to work on in order to be as pain-free as humanly possible. But it's knowing how to work so that we can be as pain-free as possible. And I've seen people with full-on twisted spines, deformed pelvises, you name it, live pain-free lives right up until, late stages of life, because they've just maintained their flexibility, strength, and balance.
Yeah, it's all about balance.
Mm-hmm.
It's balancing. Because essentially, right, again, this brain and spine of ours, it houses our spinal cord, right, and our brain, right? The skull and the vertebral bodies house the actual brain and the spinal cord, and that's our nervous system. So that's where all these little, right, really nervy branches come off of, and that just keeps us functioning.
That's how our body communicates, and I've had clients that couldn't move, and just through the process of yoga nidra, thinking about moving their fingers, they were able to start to move their fingers. And it's like, you think before you do, right? So even if we're just thinking about changing our ribs or strengthening our pelvis or accessing our baby toe, whatever it may be, that's stage one.
So, and then just another thing back, so I was talking about how, right, all of a sudden we have this blood flow now descending the legs, taking way less pressure off of the heart, right? So then that pumping, that blood, and just essentially blood pressure starts to lower. Well, then that's just totally going to chill out our whole nervous system, right? And in our day and age, it's really important to make sure that we're not always, we're really finding the ways to just calm ourselves down and just be a little bit more sedated, and that just, disengages a lot of those cortisol hormones, those adrenaline hormones that, can lead to illness. Same thing with it. It allows the immunity system, which is that lymphatic, right? We were talking about that last class. We're just kind of pumping and trying to get that movement of the lymph to work more at a maximum kind of optimal level.
And the only way that I understand that can move lymph is through basically like stretching it. Is that correct? So it's like a one-way pump. Can you talk a little bit to that?
Well, no, you actually back and forth. The lymphatic system likes to have a little bit of movement, because it actually is quite superficial.
Like this.
Yes. Yeah. It's superficial, right? So those clusters of lymphatic nerves, which are a little bit more on the left, and then also the groins are two of the main big clusters of lymphatic nerves. So we can just make sure that we keep that going.
Yeah. Keep it pumping, because it requires movement to move. It's the only system that doesn't regulate itself. It requires us to actually physically move, right?
Walk around.
So if you think of, say, the groin lymphatic system, right? If we are sitting in a chair constantly, right, and we're not externally rotating, internally rotating, squeezing, pumping, moving it, it gets very, very stagnant. Same with if we're not lifting our arms above our heads, that incredibly important part of our system, which just keeps cleaning our body from illness and sending out things to fight illness. You've got better words for that than me. If it's just sitting there doing nothing, getting stagnant, obviously our bodies aren't going to function. Obviously our immune system is not going to be at its optimum place. Move it or lose it, baby.